was just about to do a shout out. Councilman Spencer Duncan has been with us for most of this morning as well, so thanks for coming. All right, back to the application form and scoring sheet.
Okay, on the score sheet, org leadership is strong and maintains community-based representation. It's application page 3 and page 4. It's board control and board composition.
So actually, the reading that composition, the change that staff has proposed is not so much any change in the composition, but just the meeting attendance.
Yes, so to just give you the background on that, we do get feedback fairly regularly about that 65% attendance is hard to attain, and if I have a certain amount of people on my board, then, and we still have quorum, but we don't meet 65%, then you're reducing our points, and that's a good point. That's good feedback. So we talked about a way to reword that, but it just seemed like a better solution to take that attendance piece out, because if they're a functioning nonprofit, I think it's fairly safe to assume that their board meets regularly and has enough people to make decisions, or they wouldn't be continuing to function. In terms of feedback on the racial and ethnic makeup of boards and gender makeup, staff's going to continue to recommend that the boards of agencies and our governing body should look like the community that they serve. And you guys have the ability to change that in whatever way that you want, but we are not going to come to you with a recommendation. In fact, if we made a recommendation, it would be to raise the percentages, because this is lower than the percent of if you take all of the racial and ethnic minorities in our population, it's lower. So really, we feel like we've conceded all that we feel comfortable conceding, and so our recommendation remains the same, to leave that language. It's important.
Go ahead. I was just thinking about the racial and ethnic minority makeup. I know at one meeting, Mike, you had given information, is it the Latino leadership, that you train young Latinos to go out and serve in community. So I think hookups, there has to be some way to maybe be of assistance or service to get information out there. There's all types of organizations, I believe, that are training young, diverse board members and even not so young board members. And so I just find it interesting why there seems to be a problem with getting, the ethnic and racial makeup to be more, like you said, more reflective of the community. 15%, I think, is really doing a lot of these boards favors, but unless others are prone to, wanting to change it, my thing is it should be at least 20%, but that's just me. Yeah.
Thank you, Christina. To follow up on that, you're right. There are a lot of groups, organizations that are trying to help fill those boards and committees, because a lot of them are aging, and a lot of them are all of one group, not by design a lot of times, but just by availability of those people who want to serve. Because you have to make a commitment. You have to say you're going to be there, you're going to serve, you're going to be at all the meetings. I don't know that some clearinghouse, I know that I have been asked by like Papin's Landing, for instance, they asked me for that, and I sent it to Kay, sent her the list, and it's to them then to vet through that group to see who has that interest and wants to serve on their board. But I know, Leadership Greater Topeka, there's another organization in town for Black Americans that are doing the same thing. There are groups and bodies. It's a matter of reaching out. It's just like anything else. You just can't put an ad in the paper and see who's going to show up. You have to network out. You have to reach out to people in order to find that mix, because once you find it, I think all the boards and committees who have made that effort to do so would unanimously say that it has brought a better conversation to their meetings and a better result to the work that they do. So I would tend to agree with Christina that 15% is being, okay, if you can at least do that. I don't think we should at least do the minimum. I think an increase in that would be more representative and telling of what we want to see this community do with regards to inclusion. So I wouldn't be opposed to that or making a committee proposal as part of our recommendation to the full council to increase that to at least 20% by 5%. Because the people are out there. And I know you got to ask. I see some.
You have to have an interesting agency. Nobody's really interesting in aging.
Us aging people are.
Yeah, a lot of them.
Be glad to provide the names.
She needs to go.
Oh.
We may need you to come up to the mic if. That was my question. Okay.
I know that,
That's all right.
and I hear those arguments, and I'm not getting into a disagreement with you, but I've heard them from day one when I came on the police department, and they said they couldn't find Latinos to be policemen. And it's followed me through my entire career. You have to reach out. You have to find them. I'm not saying they're standing in line, knocking on your door to be there, but you have to cultivate that. And everybody says that they're not interested in aging. You're all going to age, so plan on it. If everything goes well, you'll live a long life, and you'll be interested in those services. But don't plan on it when you're 65. Look at it at a younger age. But we have to, myself included, people of my age need to look at people who are younger than me by 20, 30 years and say, we need your input because I want to make sure things are in place when I get to that point when I need them. So I know that it's preaching to the choir, but there are people out there, you really have to cultivate them.
And I agree with that so much. I think that there's another component is that in the realm of boards and leadership, for those that have been outside of the system for so long and probably from the beginning, that cultivation is important. That outreach is important. I know everybody's busy, like working hard, don't have the time to do it. But the bottom line is that underrepresented communities are not as familiar with this realm, and at times they do need to have that hand that goes, we want you involved. Because I received United Way training on board leadership years and years ago, and I put myself out there and I was never asked. And so also I think that as these young professionals that are with the, is it Go Topeka or Forge or all of these young professionals that are out here, and I have seen some of color folks in there, utilize, see if they would be interested as well. I think that we have to work collectively to try to change the face of the boards that are making these decisions in Topeka. And Mike, I agree wholeheartedly that outreach is crucial. Mm-hmm. It just is.
Well, and I've been in that position of doing that outreach, and they're right. I mean, once you do it, it does make for a better board. But it takes, not all the groups that say that their advocacy will give you names, though. You have to kind of connect in. You know, the Jump Coalition now has 1,000 people showing up for the Nehemiahs. Maybe there are people, that's quite a diverse group. Now, not everybody wants to be on a board. Some people like to just do activities, and even when you're seeking board members, it's okay if you get so-and-so and so-and-so who really just want to sit at the informative table at the fairs for you, which is good, and you need that, and others who are more oriented toward budgets and strategic planning and so on. So it's a challenge. I want to ask about the other part, though, the attendance. Just to elaborate a little more for my colleagues, I think one place this came from is that some agencies have really big boards and they don't control their own nomination. I do know, however, that having this on there has prompted them, similar to the conversation we just had otherwise, to reach out to those sources and ask them to be more intentional about who they put on the board so that they really are participating and so on. So I wonder, though, because I think this was in there in part because if you've got a measure of whether an organization is functioning well is whether they've got a quorum, you know, whether their board is actually participating. And that's, I think, where the original group was going with this. And 65% seemed reasonable. But organizations are different in terms of what their quorums are. And I'm not sure what the quorums are for those agencies with the big boards. But if we didn't leave the attendance, didn't push it out altogether, but instead said they had to meet, I don't know, some boards only meet 6 times a year, others meet monthly, or maybe more like 11. But if they had to meet a quorum, basically all but once, whatever that would turn out to be with a percent, is that reasonable?
I think it is. I think if you're able to conduct the business of the organization and move forward, then you are doing what you said you were going to do. It'll continue to be fellow board members' responsibilities to reach out to their fellow board members and say, we need you here to help us make these decisions. And that's
right
on them. But as long as they're able to make quorum and conduct business and move forward and not just, and still be representative of the organization, I think we should allow them to give, to move forward with their work and not penalize it. So I like the fact that they've suggested that be removed from there.
Well, but the removal has to do with
The
this
attendance.
group setting a 65% attendance.
Yeah.
But if we want to leave something in there about attendance, then would making reference to a quorum help that?
Yeah,
I think so.
it would.
And so if does regularly have a quorum? That's a pretty squishy word.
Regularly.
And 80% would mean you'd all but one meeting a year, probably.
So make quorum
One or
80%.
two, depending on how often the agency board meets. Does this ask what the percentage of attendance is?
Yeah, it does on page 3. Average percentage of board membership
Attending
attending
meetings.
meetings in the past 12 months.
So you've had the direct conversations with the agencies. If we changed it to quorum, would that help resolve?
I think the agencies that complain about that particular one, that would resolve their issue.
Okay. And 80%?
It's up to your pleasure.
So then we'd have to change the question, but
So like the red line where it says meets regularly over 65% attendance, we could put meets regularly with a quorum of board members in attendance at least 80% of the time.
Yes,
And then
exactly.
that would get them 5 points. And then the next two criteria, the 3 and the 0, that would go back to 3 of 4 criteria have been met for 3 points, and less than 3 criteria have been met for 0.
Yeah,
Okay?
I think so. If,
Okay,
is there,
Could you
Consensus
restate
on
that
that?
again, huh?
I will. So the sentence would be at least 15% is made of racial or ethnic minorities, is less than 70% of one gender, meets regularly with a quorum of board members in attendance at least 80% of the time, and has a healthy mix of needed skills and resources.
And if there's consensus too, or I don't know if we vote on this or what, but bumping it up to 20% from the 15. How Mike and I were talking about, at least 20% is made up of racial or ethnic minorities.
If there's not a consensus, my preference would be that you vote. If you
Yeah.
all agree,
well, I think we could
then-
vote, I think we should probably vote on the votable ones, but since this is it all in one package here,
Before we do that, I'd like to ask for the people in attendance if they have any comment with regards to raising that from 15 to
Okay.
20%. So if anyone has any comment that they want to add,
They need to come to the podium.
yeah.
any comments, concerns? Sounds like there are.
Well, I would make a motion then.
Well, if you want to just, if you're, what you want to do is switch the 15% to 20%, then we'll consider both in the same, since this is the organizational leadership question. If we change the first one, the other two don't need the red line changes, so they would simply remain as they were.
So that would mean 3 would stay at 3 of 4 criteria
Correct.
have been met, and 0 less than 3 criteria have been met.
Yes. The motion clear? The new wording clear?
Let me read it one more time.
Okay, with the substitution.
So, Councilmember Padilla's motion would be to change the language of the first criteria on organizational leadership. Leadership is strong and maintains community-based representation on the score sheet to say at least 20% is made of racial or ethnic minorities, is less than 70% of one gender, meets regularly with the quorum of board members in attendance at least 80% of the time, and has a healthy mix of needed skills and resources.
Yes.
Yes.
Did he make a
Questions?
motion? Oh, sorry.
Yeah,
I take it as a, go ahead and entertain a motion.
I so move.
Second.
Moved and seconded. Further discussion? All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Okay. This is good discussion. If there weren't concerns, that's great. I do see this as a baseline for us to be getting ready for next fall as well. You know, there are other, for instance, the chart is asking for disabilities, and there are other minorities there. We could consider even tweaking that a little more later. Okay, and then the last one?
The
Rachelle?
last one, collaboration and partnerships, 5 points, application, page 13 and 14.
I've heard this one come up from time to time over the years from the agencies, but this isn't really a problem, is it? It's hard to imagine. Okay. Just checking. All right. Well, back to the past grant administration then, what's the thought of the committee about leaving that in or taking it out for this year?
Run that by me again.
Staff's proposal
Oh, this.
on taking the, where is that one in the,
It's not, we would take, so this would be for 2021. I would look at the 2019, like fourth quarter reports and like to see, oh wait, past grant administration. No, that would be all their quarterly reports, how they were submitted to me. Were they on time? Were they accurate? Were they invoicing on time? So it's something that I would look at each of the agencies that we were funding.
But we would be looking at the 2019 grant cycle because then she has a whole year of
Right.
program to kind of
right.
provide that information on.
So that's not anywhere in the application form. That is simply by checking the reference with the staff that has administered the grants.
But the thought had been removing it as part of just making that clean cut.
That was the thought process. We can provide that information to a vendor. You know, Rachelle could prepare a little report that it, gives the answers to basically those three for each agency that's applied. We can do that. Part of my concern about that is that many times the complaints that you guys hear is because the agencies don't like the answer, so to speak. You get what I'm saying? And what I don't want to happen is that a vendor gets complaints about how they were scored on this area, and then Rachelle is caught in the middle of that by saying, okay, well, here's the information. That's why it seems much cleaner to me to remove that for this 2020 cycle and then reevaluate at the end of this grant cycle and decide if you guys, part of it would hinge on if it continues to be outsourced to a vendor, then it would be easy to add that back in because they would have a year of monitoring those grants, right? And if it comes back in-house to staff, if the decision is made by the governing body to do away with the outsourcing, then we could also add it back in because we would pick back up that administrative piece of it where we're actually managing the reporting and the paperwork.
I have a question to those of you out there, and it just can be nods. Nobody has to run up unless you want to, but is this, in your knowledge, something that other sources score you on? A little bit, yes. Okay.
And these pieces, if I may, these three pieces here that we've talked about, that can be included in the contract that we write up with our outsourced vendor. I mean, part of what they need to do, so that, I guess we shouldn't assume that they wouldn't already do that, but it will be important to them as the vendor and handling the grants that they would see whether or not the agencies are reporting and invoicing on time and all those kind of things.
Absolutely.
So we can be specific about making sure that that's part of what they will do.
Is monitor that. Well,
Yeah,
that's included in the RFP and would definitely go into the contract language. In fact, the way that we had discussed setting it up with finance is that, and internally, with feedback from finance, there you go, that's the right way to say it. So we prefer to hold the dollars and issue checks to the agencies based on the vendor receiving those reports and then reconciling that against the information in the application, all of that process, and then submitting to city an invoice, so to speak, that says, okay, you need to send this dollar amount to these agencies based on they've completed their reporting and all their receipts match up to what they've reported, that audit kind of process. So that's, we are expecting for the vendor to monitor that.
Okay.
But I would add one little footnote just for you guys to think about on this one in particular. So if we think this through, and I always get a little twisted up because we're talking about, we're going to outsource the application process for our 2021 grants, right? That's what we're talking about. And so if the kind of idea is that this committee is going to move to pull that back in-house for 2022 cycle, we need to think carefully about this one, because if it goes out for the application process and then comes back in, perhaps if your intention is to pull it back in, then we need to probably to leave this, right? Because staff would then pick back up that monitoring beginning of 2021, because the grants will have been awarded for 2021, but if the vendor goes away, somebody has to monitor the grant. You get what I'm saying? I may not be explaining that as clearly as I'd like, but we need to think about how that is going to play itself out in those future years, because we are talking about future years. So if I have a contract with a vendor that does the application process for this year, and they bring back to you guys the recommendation of the funding, but then your intention is to get rid of them in 2021 for the 22 cycle, then we would need to figure out a transition where that administration comes back, because the contracts would be with the vendor and the agencies. Do you get what I'm saying? No, I don't know that
Well,
but the looks on your faces, I'm not sure.
This first contract is going to be for a full year. You wouldn't be firing the vendor before they ever even managed a contract, would we? We?
We would do for this application cycle was our intention, but the actual monitoring doesn't kick in until the next year. You get?
Correct.
So that's what I feel like we need to think through and think critically about.
So there would be almost like a half contract the first year as you're seeing it, because they would only be doing the applications the first year, and then you would do a cycle that actually started in 2021 that would have both layers in it, because by that time they'd be administering the first ones and processing the new ones.
Yes, yes, you're tracking exactly what I'm saying. If the intention of this committee is to support that vendor outsourcing for the upcoming year, then you could leave, you can leave it in or take it out either way. But I just want you to be mindful of that, because if the intention is to pull it back in-house, if the three of you don't want to support that like the previous committee did, we need to be thinking about how that impacts the reporting piece, I guess is what I'm saying.
I understand what you're saying, and that's a whole lot to chew on right now. My thought is that, my concern about this whole thing is it really going to, which will have to be borne out later, but is it really going to end up saving money? That's my concern. I get that we have to be anticipating more ahead than what this is marking out initially was saying or
guess-
trying to do.
When you do it at all, I mean, I guess I hadn't thought about that, but the concern that I have is having been on this committee, it's interesting to go through this process, because it probably took us, I was on the original committee, probably took 6 meetings, who can remember, to come up with this format. And so, and I don't think anybody's taken the time until you all to learn it. And it's good. You do need to be inside it. I guess my thought back to this particular thing is, once you take it out, it's not there. The next committee sees this blank piece of paper, and it'll be us again this fall. So that'll be good. But if it's important enough to be in there, I guess to me, it ought to be in there. And then, in fact, we could consider this, even for now, the scoring isn't done. If an agency hasn't been funded by the city, but the agency has existed before, then checking their reporting history with whoever has funded them before is a phone call.
And what staff can do, if the committee prefers that we leave this in, what we will do with the vendor is provide a report from Rachelle to the vendor on here's the performance on this reporting piece by the agencies in 2019, and they can assign the score based on the information that we provide. She won't be scoring it, though.
I like that. I can see something like that.
Because I guess I think if what we're looking for is an agency that has a track record of reporting, whether it's to us or somebody else, that, yeah, I think for this one transition, it's better to leave it than to take it out and then try and put it back. But I understand your rationale, I do.
I support leaving it in.
Well, I'm listening to Sasha, and I listened to her last week. It kind of seems like you came around on a 180 on me.
I just don't know that this is a hill worth staff dying on, basically.
Yeah.
I mean, that was our recommendation and our thought, but it's not so critical to me that I want to fight with you guys about it.
Oh, I don't see it as a fight, but I understood your reasoning to begin with. But your comments today, maybe you're made with a week's time to give it more thought.
And collaborative.
I don't have, pardon?
Collaborative effort.
Yeah, and I don't have an issue with it. It's just I want to make sure that somehow, if not staff, then a vendor is going to be doing these things. And I'll be honest with you, I can say right now, I don't have any idea what my intent or this committee's intent would be to take it out or leave it in or the next year or whatever. I'm not in a hurry to make changes on a regular basis after we've gone through this whole effort. So I want to make sure that we've put together what we think we can work with effectively for a while at least, without giving some thought that, okay, the next committee is going to change it again, because I know that's the history or some history that this group has had, and I'd like to be able to establish some consistency for a while so that we don't do that.
And just to be completely honest and clear, so the recommendation to remove it was based on the thought process that how this has worked historically is that Rachelle provides the score on this one. But if we remove her from that and she just provides reporting to a vendor, then that neutralizes it. That was my concern, is that she'd get jammed up in the middle of a disagreement between a vendor, an agency, and then she's in the middle of that. And I prefer not to put her in that position.
Well, and maybe the third party thing then is pointing up that it's how you ask for the report to go, and so it's putting up some healthy things perhaps, because and if there was a simple way to do that, asking other funders could be asked as well.
Yeah, I made a note of that. And
So you
we
mean
get
like
to-
putting her, giving the reports and then putting language in the contract that builds that kind of
Right.
barrier where they're not calling, or she's not being put in that position. They're dealing with the information they've been given. They have the new application, boom, there, figure it. And-
Well, what she would do is report whether the reporting was on time and whether it was accurate.
That's pretty cut
You
and
know,
dried.
and however it would be reported or scored, and then they could assess from there. I think with anything that anybody scores, if someone wants to appeal that, it needs to be defended, of course. And so that's, again, we'll talk about appeals here in a moment. Well, if we want to leave that, I hear you.
I can live with that.
One of the things about leaving it is it puts that message in that it's important to we get a lot of message from filling out our applications as to what our funders think is important. So I'm okay with leaving it. If that's the case, then unless somebody has suggestions for any other changes, we will in fact be leaving this quite consistent and leaving the questions as they are with that one change. Anything else anybody wants to change this time? If not, we will, and Rachelle, real briefly, are there any, just kind of for our purposes in the future, any sections in this application then that are where we're asking questions but they're not scored? We jumped around, which I think is fine, but
We asked about the program budget, which is not scored. And we also asked for demographics. I think that the
clients.
key of the demographics was really for the mainly for the CDBG funds that we use, just to see, to make sure that we're getting demographics across the communities.
well, and that's partly how, and we didn't touch on this before, but how you all decide which programs get funded with CDBG money and which ones don't,
Correct.
to make sure that anything that gets tagged with that source, okay?
Very much, yeah.
There's some language on page 5, there's process to verify income and for clients and what donated goods and services do you receive that add value?
We have to have that.
Do those really get,
What page was that? I'm sorry.
well, it's on page 5.
Well, this would be for CDBG.
Yeah, so the verifying income is another CDBG question to see if that's the way
Okay.
we are going to,
Yeah.
if that agency will use CDBG funds or general fund.
Those are kind of CDBG too.
I don't know that we really need the donated goods or volunteer services. It's not being scored.
Well, I asked
It's
because I
important.
knew that and the budget was in here too. It's something for us to think about for future in terms of, well, two things. Those reviewers may consider those things in their discussion about program management, in their ratings on program management and so on, that we don't see that one-on-one correlation with. But certainly the budget issues and those donated goods and services have to do with that. Something for us to consider next time. And now we've all got copies of the app, which is really helpful. Thank you so much. All right. The next thing that we had on our agenda was to talk about appeals. The committee prior to us at, let's see, and there's language. The language about the appeals is on page 5 of tab 4B. The way that process went was that people turned in their request for appeal to the staff, and the appeals were held before the what would now be the Social Services Committee.
Which, if it would be helpful, can we talk about this appeal sheet?
Sure.
Just real quickly while
Sure.
you guys, I mean, since you're going to consider that. So, so that's the yellow one. And so we have, in 2019, there were 2 agencies that actually, they didn't end up going through the appeal process because the error in the scoring was caught. I'm going to have Corey explain that so I don't
Yep.
screw it up.
Yeah, so as soon as the error was made, was brought to our attention, we immediately wanted to change the score. So we didn't really need the appeals for that to happen. But by the time we got to appeals, then it was made at this, the change was made here. But that's the backstory of that. And those were the only two agencies that we had a miscalculation. The miscalculation basically was in the application process in EC Impact. You put your outputs and outcomes in that application. As we discussed at the end, when you get your actual allocation, you have a chance to modify those outputs and outcomes. You have to do that in the contract that we have with the agency, which we did, but the agency did not make those changes in EC Impacts, which is where the reports are pulled. So when we went to look to see if their outputs and outcomes were made for the year, we were using what was in EC Impact, which was not updated because they hadn't went in and entered that. So staff has made changes to verify that when we issue our contracts and they make those updated, that we are verifying now to make sure that they have updated it also in EC Impact so that doesn't happen again.
So otherwise, these denials occurred based on, well, they were appealing because they were not to get funded, and it was based on their scoring.
These were the appeals. Some of these people did get funded. They maybe not funded at the level that they wanted, which is why they appealed. So this list indicates just everybody that appealed.
Okay.
So they may have gotten funded. Maybe they got an 87 and they wanted an 89 and they were appealing for those 2 points. So that could have happened on this particular list that you're looking at.
The blue one shows you the ones that actually were not funded.
Okay, so,
It's a little confusing, but we tried to make it as clear as we could because, as Corey pointed out, there are agencies that were funded but still appealed their score because the higher score equates to more dollars.
yeah, actually, didn't CRC go off in 2017?
Back to the
Oh, I guess not.
budget.
Yes.
Oh,
No,
no,
they
they
did
did
not.
not.
They did.
No,
They were on
They didn't
probation.
apply and
What happened was that we
Probation.
set some pretty serious, we went through, we spent the time with them to go through the concerns that people had. And then the following year, they again didn't make it and they didn't get funded. So actually spent 2 years on that. And when the appeal happened, and that's happened with some other organizations too, I mean, they brought their board. So that process allowed them to go through what it was that wasn't working.
So with the appeal process, when the agencies that are appealing come together and they talk about what they believe the issues were that they believe, if corrected or given the chance to correct, they should have been given funding. So what I saw from the appeal process was it seemed to me like it was just a really like a venting session, more or less. What is the process? I mean, is the decision made as they're appealing it, like right here at the table, that you guys, are going, well, no, we're not going to do
the
this?
committee votes to
And
grant,
I think
to
this
grant the
language
appeal or not.
gives the committee 7 days, so they don't have to vote right there on the spot if they don't want to, but it's a quick turnaround so that it's resolved. I don't know if any time the committee has actually taken extra time beyond that one meeting, have they?
Not that I can remember.
I personally don't like that. I don't think that that's much of an appeal process to be. Yeah, I think it should maybe have a little bit more thought and consideration, even if that ends up bottom line, nope, we're not going to do it. It's just not, the argument isn't strong enough. You know, whatever the case may be, we're still going to deny it. But in a turnaround time of that much, that seems just incredibly quick to me.
Well, the flip side of that is that if we've done our job right and we've got a good solid application form, we've got a good solid application process, the scoring has been thought through, the agencies have had the training on it, then the scoring should be pretty straight up. And then we've done a good job of selecting our reviewers, people that really know the area, outcomes as well as nonprofits. Then the score should be pretty solid. And the committee is held that way. But nonetheless, what has happened, what happened with two of them was that process gave the chance to point up the fact that the scores were wrong, because the sheet had already been done and turned into the committee, so it had to be changed in order to, so before I get into the committee, that opportunity, let them speak up and get a correction made. Certainly the committee has learned that's a way for the committee to get feedback about how clear the system is, what the questions are, how people understand it, and so on. Even if the score was solid, it's a chance for them to speak up. I don't want to, generally that process has been very respectful and people have been given a reasonable amount of time to do that.
Which, if I could just give you all some feedback on what you just said. Even if there were no appeal process, staff would have handled the situation with the incorrect scores in the same way. The agency would have contacted us and told us that there was an error, and we would have looked at it and said, oh, you're right, and we would have fixed it, and we would have still brought it to the committee. I can assure you that still would have happened.
So I think I was on the committee that year, and I think it came to your attention through the appeal process anyway.
Absolutely, but I can't imagine that we would create a system, even if we did away with appeals, where agencies couldn't provide us feedback on.
Ask a question.
Yeah, or ask a question about, hey, why did I get?
I was someone who was favorable on the appeals process. We didn't have it the very first year. We put it in the second year. And to me, it drove back to remembering being one of those agency directors and bringing my children and putting them to sleep in City Hall and being last on the agenda, and all of us doing the hearings about the social service agencies between 10 p.m. and 1 a.m. every year, because we were last. But the council was kind enough to hear us out. And the decisions were all made at the council level, even after recommendations from a very capable committee. We all showed up and made our pitches anyway, respectfully. And that if the council's goal at the time they set this process up was to have a good, solid process that was defensible, that therefore did not come to the council. That the council, we would set up a system whereby the council would support the work of the committee. And in doing that, if there wasn't a chance for people to be heard, if they had a concern, it didn't seem that the system would work. That we needed to allow that not just as a venting process, but as a process to hear and learn. For that time, if there really was an error in the scoring, how else would we know if particularly now putting it out to a third party, if somehow that scoring didn't seem right when explained to us, and we might need some help on outputs and outcomes and things like that. But if it really didn't seem to ring true, we need to know that. And if there's not an opportunity for somebody to pitch it to the committee, they will go to the council. That's a big duty on the part of the committee, but that was the idea that the council at the time had in mind. Yeah, it also means that you have to build a culture that once the committee makes the recommendations, even though I have trouble with some of these choices and decisions sometimes, I personally voted not to change the committee's decision because the essence of making this system work is that the committee has done everything they can to make sure a good job was done, and then they stand by it, and that the council stands by that.
Right. And again, I understand there's much I need to learn, but what was dropped into my lap during the summer was 3 senior centers. And I didn't look at, and maybe it'd be beneficial for me to look at the scoring that happened. I understand that this is getting outsourced, but the bottom line is 3 organizations that do the work were not funded, 0. And if it wouldn't have been for Councilman Padilla, bringing it forth, and I would say to a point, me continuing to push as well once getting on council, it just, they would have been funded. And I understand they're getting funded from other locations. I just want to understand or want to make sure that what happened of this gravity, because it is, I mean, they're located in, lower, underserved neighborhoods, is that it doesn't happen to that extent again, because it was so concentrated that it just raised deep flags, red flags for me. I know I'm no expert.
Can I respond to that?
Sure.
So I would point out that actually in the 2020 cycle, there were 4 agencies that were not funded by the Social Service Grants Committee. So it's the 3 senior centers and Community Action Latino Family Development. So that was the 4th agency. And I would also like to point out that I understand your concern about the aging, the senior centers and the services to the aging population, but this is an unbiased, objective process. And so I just want to say out loud that there was certainly no intent by staff or review committee members to single out any agencies. That was the way that the scores shook out. And this sheet, I think, was super beneficial in kind of exemplifying that every year there are agencies that do not get funded because we don't have enough money to fund them all. And it's difficult every year for this committee to accept those scores and have to, deal with the kind of the consequences of those decisions with agencies that this group always cares about. Do you get what I'm saying? So I understand your concern for the seniors, but I think if you want to have a productive conversation about what you're talking about, you got to look at all of the agencies that don't get scored. And when you start to follow that kind of thought process through to the end, where are we going to get the funding? I mean, I don't know that we have a solution to the fact, well, I know that we don't have a solution to the fact that we have a limited amount of resources to make available to the agencies. So there are always agencies that don't get funded.
Yeah, I understand that.
I don't want anyone to think that we're picking on the senior centers
Right.
or.
No. I don't
if
think
you
it's,
look at the
right. I don't think it's seen as a
history.
senior center, I'm not even framing it in that context. What I'm framing it in is all I heard with numerous conversations, either with board or director or the seniors that went there that were keeping up on what was going on. And I think that there was some concern about that, their voice wouldn't be heard, or that maybe they shouldn't speak up because, there would be repercussions in the following grant cycles. I don't know if that's the mindset for how all agencies feel, but I also have to bring those forth. I mean, because we understand that this work is hard, no doubt. Their jobs are hard, no doubt, and the seniors are the ones that are left hanging. There is nothing with accusations of deliberately to seniors. What it raised flags for me was serious concerns for them and for their services and what they would be able to provide because they were senior centers. That's my red flag, is to make sure that, something was able to be done, which Mike was able to help propel forward, so.
Well, and what we are facing with the priorities sheet that we have this time is the same amount of money that we had last year, the same number of agencies, including the senior centers, and a hard and fast percent or formula for which the funding is going to get granted. And so instead of us being able to go in and say, well, anybody over 86% gets funded and we'll share the pie that way, the scoring that's in there says that anybody, the higher you score, the more money you get. And those agencies that score the highest get a percent of what they asked for until the money's gone, and then nobody else gets any money. And there will almost undoubtedly, because these are all seasoned agencies with us, be at least 5 agencies that don't get funded next year. Because if the senior centers are back in, you get the same playing field pretty much. And so nobody knows who that will be, but that's the way this system was set up. It was intended to have the scores be a real driver in who got funded, so that we were outcomes based and the best agencies were the ones that got funded. And also correspondingly to weed out those that were not competitive for whatever reason. And there have been agencies that have been dropped off over time. Progressively, a couple of them that went through the appeals process, and the groups that if I recall correctly, with this one agency that went through a couple of years, we had the capacity to adjust the base and leave them in even though their scores were lower than ideal, but eventually they were not able to cut it and dropped off. And so you don't know who that's going to be. And as Director Haehn said, we can't fund everybody. So, and there is a constituency for each group. And that's where the appeals come in. And that's where, standing by, really doing the work up front like we just did on the process, so that we can stand by it. It's not easy. We may want to change for next year if there was a poison pill in this process, it's that the more seasoned the agencies get with getting their scores up, the higher the threshold was going to be, and that's exactly where we've gotten. I'm not certain what the solution is for that.
No, and that was a large part of what drove the decision by a prior committee to lock that scoring piece that's on the bottom of the priority sheet, which I apologize, at the last meeting I got hung up in a year prior to that or something. I don't know what I was talking about, but So the decision was made to add this language and essentially lock that scoring system, because every year, as we kind of worked through this process, staff was running out of new and creative ideas, and in terms of a formula to bring you where we could spread as much money across as we could. And it was clear that the intent that the committee had was to have a competitive grant process that awarded those that performed the best. And so that's where this language it sprang from, was staff's request to the committee to consider locking the formula so that every year we aren't trying to come up with a new way to split up the money, because that we were running out of new ways to split up the money. And consistently, agencies gave us feedback that every year that you change that formula, we would prefer to have a consistent, we know how everything is graded and scored and how it shakes out. So that's the history on that little piece of language, is that we felt like it provided much more consistency to the agencies, to staff, to the committee. We all understand that we're going to do the same thing each year in the scoring part of it. And I think there's value in that. And to respond to you guys' concerns about, the competitive process kicks people out, it does. It absolutely does. But our understanding, staff's understanding, is that the intention of the committee and the governing body, and we would fully support that and recommend to you that you are looking for the agencies that perform the best and to include their application. And my advice to agencies that fell short would be to consider getting a grant writer to help you, or reaching out to other resources in the community, rather than turning to the committee and the governing body and saying, you just need to give us more money because we can't meet the threshold. And Karen's exactly right. There are always going to be agencies under this system that will not get funded. So your alternative would be to think about, well, what do we just want to fund everybody because we like all of these agencies and we like what they do in the community? Because if that's what you want, that's way easier. We just count up the number of agencies and we divide it by the number of dollars that are other way around. Divide the dollars by the number of agencies, and there's what you get. And everybody gets an equal amount, but I would caution you to think carefully about that, because on the backside, you're going to have people say, well, my agency does more than their agency, and I serve this many people, and they only serve that. I mean, ugh.
Yeah.
So
my thinking is never that simplistic.
it's hard to. These are difficult discussions, because we all value these agencies and the programs that they provide. We all do. And it's uncomfortable and hard, and nobody likes it to be in the position to just say, no, we don't have enough to fund all of you. So that's really what it feels like the committee struggles with. And that, to be honest with you, is what drove the decision for the outsourcing. Here's how much we think we're going to save, that was just an ancillary benefit. And because we are trained to provide you guys with the financial implications of what our actions mean, that's where that information came from. So please don't misunderstand that that's what was driving it, because it wasn't. And it was last year's Chair Cohen, that said, hey, we met with him before the season kicked off, and he said, what do you guys think about outsourcing it? And we said, that'd be amazing, because this process is as painful for myself and my staff as it is for this committee. Nobody likes it. And I'm not saying that we should stop doing it. We didn't go that far. But the thought process was that if it was removed and a third party did it, a neutral third party, and you guys really embrace that as a vendor, we're going to outsource this, and what their process and decision is what, with oversight of their process, that would insulate this committee and the governing body members from all that political backlash that every year makes this such a painful process. That was what drove that recommendation to the governing body.
Yeah, and I understand that from watching the past meetings last year, that Representative or former Councilman Cohen drove a lot of that from the first meeting. I will counter any of that until whenever I get out of office, because we have to learn how to take that heat, whether it's valid or not. Myself as a representative, any of us as representatives, and sometimes I think we get heat. Sometimes what I run into is just people wanting more understanding, and this is a political realm, and it always will be. So I know it's hard on staff, because you're not elected politicians like, we are. It's part of being a public servant, and I feel like I can say that just because I did it as a public servant for the feds and for the city for so many years. It is hard. It's also our job, but now we're outsourcing, so let's just make that, like Karen said, and everybody has agreed, the best that it can be. And I think we're getting there. I really do.
If I may.
Yes.
I want to address a couple of things that were commented on. Having said on the committee last year as well, I think that there was some direction given by previous committee members to get us to this point with regards to outsourcing. And having been a city employee for years and gone through a lot of those struggles about who gets what and who doesn't get what they ask for, that's not an issue with me. I understand that. I know there's only so many dollars to be given. It just seemed to me that for a process that was in place, curious that the 3 senior age centers fell in that category. It wasn't mixed throughout the rest of the applicants. It was senior centers. And so I didn't ever assume that they were targeted or singled out. What I wondered about, though, is how a process that's equitable across the board would somehow end up with what I thought are some of the most important areas to look at, to take care of in our community, that they would be left out of the whole process, that because the process that we had in place somehow, either the process or their understanding of how to compete in that process put them in a position where senior centers were not given the funding to serve a population that has little attention, in my opinion. So that was my initial red flag, is about the process, not the people putting it into place, like yourself and staff. It never became about individuals. It was about what I thought a process that might be flawed, that would somehow shake out. We would be asking the same question if it all shook out and all of our youth programs ended up not being funded. We'd say, well, what happened there? Why did this group somehow shake out and didn't get what they asked for? So that was our initial intent from last year's committee, as I understand it. And we talked about looking into doing what we are doing now, but never had the opportunity to do that. And I'm thinking that if an understanding of the process is given full attention, that maybe we'll understand how that happened and be in a better position, not necessarily to make it possible for everybody to get something, because that's just not possible, but make it possible for people to better understand what they have to do in order to be as competitive as possible with what we have put into place. Because it just seems still to me an anomaly, I guess, that 3 senior centers didn't get in the cut, and it wasn't because of somebody purposefully singling them out. I think it was just the way the process worked out, and it began to sound to me that process was more important than people, and that's where I get my backup. I'll be honest with you about that. Whenever, in any case, in any service-oriented situation, when process becomes more important than the people that it serves, then I think we've lost our way. So I am very appreciative of the time that you guys have given to sit and try and explain this more in detail, because it is complicated, and it is kind of convoluted in some ways. And I think that we've done a good job at getting a better understanding of what we're trying to accomplish, rather than trying to say, well, let's, even in saying we'll give it to somebody else to do, we still need to understand what that other vendor is doing on our behalf. We're the citizens. It still has to be our understanding. We just can't approach the work of this committee at arm's length. So having said that, I want to ask the question about this appeal process. If we keep it with the vendor, and that's my, I guess, intent, because we've made that decision, how would that appeal process be handled by the vendor? Do we know? I mean, will it be significantly different, or are we at that point where we're trying to determine how we ask that vendor to do an appeal process?
The vendor, we've talked about this internally, and the thing that makes the most sense from staff's perspective is the vendor would serve in the same role as staff and present you with the scores and provide answers to questions about, well, why did this agency, because this is something that you haven't seen yet, but you will see it. Why did this agency get 3 on this one instead of 5? And then the staff provides the feedback on, well, here's what the committee said. And then go through that appeal process, just like you normally do. Staff's not going to hear the appeals.
Okay, and once they've done that, if we keep the appeal process in place, then that vendor will hear the appeals.
No, you will hear the appeals.
Well, that's what I want to know what our role will be. If it will be the vendor hearing the appeals, or it'll come to this committee for the appeals.
Yeah, no, yes. If you choose to keep the appeals, you guys will do the appeals. You will decide on the appeals. So where it says that the appeal must be submitted in writing to staff, blah, 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 just substitute vendor for staff, and then the process remains the same. I lost the page that was on.
Well, get our name updated too.
Is it, yeah, because it says ECD.
Yeah,
no.
we'll update that, and there's, yes, there's some other updates we will be making to this document, but, yeah, where it says ECD, that's you guys, we'll change it to social services. Where it says Department of Neighborhood Relations, substitute the vendor for that.
So with my fellow committee members, I don't know yet if we've discussed about that, if we want to receive that appeal process,
Well,
or what do we want to talk about?
I think it would be good, we're going to need to wrap up, and I think if we could decide that, I think with the process that Sasha has described, that if that appeal, if the process is handled by the vendor, but then there are appeals, if that vendor then accepts those appeals, then they bring them to this committee, and the staff is here as well, then all of us together, because we're the ones who are going to set up the process for the following year. We're the ones who are going to change the questions if they didn't work. We're the ones who are going to prioritize the scoring. So the way we get the feedback from somebody, we'll ask it from everyone, but if we hear those appeals, then we'll know, we'll be on the front lines about whether it was the agency didn't get it, or maybe there's some tweaking we need to do in the system. Again, the way that's gone in the past is nobody's changed the system for that current year. The scores, if they were solid, they stay, and you can see that in the appeal history. But we learn from that in terms of making any changes we're going to make from the future. I really think that's the way to operate at the best at the committee level, as well as to people still can go to their council member or can show up if they want to But that process with a committee that was really involved and a respectful and complete appeal process, we had almost nobody that went to the council, even with all these changes, because people had been hurt. So I think we should put it back in. Or leave it in, I should, well,
Yeah, I think too that there's going to be a meeting at 1 and need to have a room set up, so we need
Right.
to, yeah.
well, are people prepared to deal with the appeal issue? Right now, there is a committee, there was a vote from our predecessor committee to drop the appeal process for next year. If we think it should be in, we should decide that today, if possible.
I think it should be in.
The one thing I want to ask from staff, if we keep the appeal process in, it falls on us, not you, to make any changes and again, it would be for the following year, but not for that current year, correct?
We could make changes for that year. It is up to us. We're the ones, the staff, and then in this case, the vendor as well, and help me out if I mess up, Sasha, has gone through the professional process using the forms that we created to score and rank and then make allocations based on this formula that's here. If we hear an appeal and we are convinced that someone's score was not correct on some rating, we have to hear why they think it is, and we have to believe it somehow. We're the ones who are recommending these allocations to the council. That is the committee report.
And that's some of what why I asked the question is, I think it's incumbent upon us as a committee to make that decision and not put that weight on the staff. They've done all their work, they've presented
Correct.
everything, and then I think it's up to us, if we keep the appeal process, that we accept that responsibility and not deflect it.
Exactly.
Okay.
Agree.
Entertain a motion?
That be a motion to keep the appeal process?
Yes.
I'll second it.
Motion and seconded. Further discussion? All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
All right. Thank you. Okay, we did what we planned to do. We took our time. We made some good progress. We
I didn't
have
realize it was that late. I wasn't looking at the
questions about the
just one.
vendor qualifications, which is really timely, I'm afraid. Vendor resource for future years, calendar, and so on. A meeting to finish this agenda would be shorter than this one, I imagine. Staff, you already have your deadline met, you have applicants?
We received one proposal, so we are going to reopen the RFP and
Okay.
proactively market the service to agencies in town that we know do that, and see if we don't get a better response.
I know we're going to have to get out of here. The issue of the qualifications was one that struck me that I saw on there. I also saw some questions on the online piece there. It sounded, when I read the RFP, it sounded like one of my questions for you all was going to be, how are they going to handle the money? Because it sounded like you were going to have them actually make the disbursements, but that has changed or clarified one way or another, right? So the RFP might be worded a little differently?
No, I don't think the RFP has specific language about, I'll review that and make sure, but you are correct in that when we first started talking about this, I was proposing, let's just send it all out to the vendor. Finance's preference is to keep the dollars in-house. I don't have a dog in that fight, so that's what we'll be doing. So
Okay.
we'll make sure that that's clear if it's not. I don't know that it's not, but we'll make sure.
I remember reading that and wondering how that would go, thinking that you all would have to review anyway for things like whatever technicality. At some point, you all will have some review as well, I would think, for CDBG purposes and otherwise. How long of a meeting do you think we need to finish this agenda, colleagues, and how soon? Sounds like maybe not quite so much pressure if the RFP's going out.
Hour and a half, hour?
Hour and a half and shoot for an hour?
Yeah,
Okay.
I like that.
When can we? I think just to move it along, it would be ideal if we could meet in about a week. Staff, right? Just so it's all nailed. Is there something,
The 11th and the 12th, we have the consultants for our housing study in town.
That's right.
My preference would be that we not schedule it on those dates.
okay,
The week after?
We're better off the week of the 17th.
Yeah. 18th, 19th. Early.
you have plans on the 18th?
17, 19.
I can do mornings only.
19th morning, Wednesday morning, 19th?
Yeah.
Can we do it again at 10? We have department directors meeting that morning.
I can do
10?
it earlier if you
Yeah.
want. I can do it earlier.
Oh, do you want it earlier than?
No, 10 o'clock.
At 10.
Yeah, you all have fun.
10 is better for you.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, 10 o'clock, February 19th. We'll plan it for 10 to 11:30 and see how fast we can get through it.
Yep.
Okay?
Okay.
Thank you all so much.
Thank you.
Meeting's adjourned.